listening to a podcast from The Word.
So the other day, I was out the front of my house dealing with my car, and my next door neighbor was there. And that weekend, he was telling me he'd met his daughter's boyfriend who got a record player. And daughter's boyfriend is very proud of his reggae collection, which I don't think was particularly extensive, but he had some reggae records, you know. And he was kind of trying to impress potential father-in-law with his, you know, knowledge of reggae records. This is how the world is nowadays, Mark. It wasn't like this back in the day when you and I were in this position.
I would have loved it if a suitor of one of my children tried to impress me with their reggae collection. Oh, that's perfect.
So anyway...
Pushing on an open door. Go on.
So anyway, my next door neighbour, because having that kind of slight streak of male competitiveness that none of us can ever quite, you know, conceal, decided he was going to go to a second-hand record shop and he was going to buy what he considered a slightly better reggae record than the ones that his potential son-in-law had, okay? And so he came back from the shop with this, actually. He comes back with 2/7's Clash by Culture. You've got this. Everybody knows it. Yes? Came out in 1977. It's kind of, if you like Burning Spear, you probably like Culture. You know, it was a slightly further out than the Burning Spear. Anyway, this got me quite excited because Tom's standing outside and he's produced this from his car. He's got this copy of 2/7's Clash. And I fondled it and so forth. And I felt the weight of it. And then I said, just hang on there a second. And I went inside and came to the top of the house and came down with my copy of 2/7's Clash by Culture, which is a Jamaican import from 1977. Because I'm then slightly trying to get a one-up on my next-door neighbour. Who's trying to get a slight one-up on his potential son-in-law. And we're standing there out on the side of the street in a little suburban street on a weekday. Two white chaps who are both grandfathers, okay? And I thought, if anybody drives past and they look out, they think, do you know, I've seen something I never thought I would ever see in London, in, you know, the extraordinary range and diversity of London. If a man is tired of London, he's tired of life. And eventually you get to see two blokes standing in a suburban street comparing copies of 2/7's Clash.
Mine's heavier vinyl. Yeah, I win. That's fantastic. And then boring each other with details, because it's all about the 7th of July 77, wasn't it?
Yes, album? It was, absolutely.
Wasn't that right? Marcus Garvey predicted that something was going to happen on 7/7/77, hence the 2/7's clashing.
He wasn't.
I don't know what it was he predicted.
He wasn't too hot on predictions, Marcus Garvey. Interesting man, though. Have you ever read that book about Marcus Garvey called Negro with a Hat?
No.
Really interesting story. Genuinely really interesting story. More going on there than you might think, but probably not in the line of prophecy. Anyway, I just thought that would amuse you. And so I'd share that with you.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
So Talking Heads news, which always interests me because I adore the Talking Heads. The Talking Heads are in some kind of truce, aren't they?
Oh, are they?
This is a group that split up very, very acrimoniously, as most groups do eventually, and last got together, I think, to play the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002. That is 19 years ago. 20 years ago, am I talking about? 20 years ago. And Stop Making Sense, the fantastic concert film by Jonathan Demme, is about to be re-released theatrically. Quite right, because I personally think it's possibly the best concert film ever made.
No, it's not.
Coming out, I think, on September the 11th, and it's at the Toronto Film Festival, and they're getting together to be interviewed, the four of them, by Spike Lee, which I think is quite interesting, actually, and I think that's a bit of an olive branch. And David Byrne has given this little interview talking about how he's terribly regretful about the way he behaved when they split up. And they split up, I mean, God, soon after Stop Making Sense, didn't they, in the mid-'80s, you know, because he was, and the Tom Tom Club happened and all that, because he was just, he said, I was a little tyrant at the time. And he said he was really badly behaved and really difficult to get on with. He's obviously very, very apologetic about it. So that film is coming out. That's right. So A, there's the possibility, which is a very exciting one, that the Talking Heads might reunite. B, that film is coming out. which I think is amazing, Dave. I'm sorry. Do you not think that's just an exceptional film?
I think it's very good. I think it's very good because it has a really good central idea. I watched it again not long ago. And
yeah, because you told me about how you didn't like the opening.
Well, no, it's really intriguing. No, I do. No, let me get this straight. Yeah. I do like, because that's the central idea. That's what made Jonathan Demme think this is going to make a film, which is, we'll start by David Byrne coming on the stage, places the beatbox down, starts playing the click track, and then he starts with the guitar. Psycho Killer. And then
one by one, musicians arrived.
Over a period of time, the musicians arrive. It's and if you're going to get a filmmaker like Jonathan Demme to make a concept film, you have to have a conceit. It's not just enough to say, we're exciting, point your cameras at us, and edit it to the best of your ability, and it will be fine. Yeah. You have to have an idea, which then the idea tends to get overplayed because it makes the filmmaker feel more comfortable about it. So it's like Martin Scorsese directed what is really the greatest concept film ever made, which is The Last Waltz. And the only way he convinced himself that it was a project worthy of his massive talents was to say, it's the last time. They've been on the road all their lives. Yeah. And now they're hanging up the rock and roll shoes. Of course, the truth was, they hadn't really been on the road all that long, really. Certainly not by contemporary standards.
No.
But Martin Scorsese needed that idea to make that film work. And the only thing is, as I've bored you on this subject many times in the past, the reason The Last Waltz is the greatest rock and roll live in concert film is it's all 2 shots and 3 shots. So it's all, you see the musicians looking at each other.
Yeah.
And when you go to a concert, that's what you do. You look at how they look at each other. You're watching that absolutely all the time.
Which is precisely how Bruce Springsteen's
any of that stuff.
That's how they shoot.
It's the inner drama of the group
between him and Niels Lofgren. Or whatever.
It's what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I was saying to you about watching that film again recently is how odd it is that David Byrne, when he goes to hit the high notes on the first number, Psycho Killer, just manifestly can't hit them. He can't get near them at all.
Yeah.
And you thought, if this was any other group, they'd say, stop, do it again.
Do it again.
Get somebody better to sing or whatever. No, but listen, I like David Byrne, and I've got nothing against him at all. But here's the odd thing about that film, is that you bring on musicians slowly until you got about 10 of them there. And what the additional 6 all have in common is they're better musicians than the original 4, because that's just the way it is. You know what I mean? You're bringing on absolute hotshot session players, aren't you?
Yeah.
Whereas this is the punk rock group from CBGB. They're bound to not be as good as that. So it's an intriguing contrast, I find.
I'm trying to remember who they were. Bernie Worrell, is that right?
It's all those kind of people. They're unbelievable players.
It's a fantastic film, I think. And I love the idea that, there's this idea that you get choreography with live performance, and you then get the performance. And it's one of those rare occasions where normally there's a load of backing musicians and there are people, front line of girl singers or whatever, who are dancing. But there's an amazing sequence with Life During Wartime. Do you remember that?
I think the girl singer. That's the high step-in thing.
The girl singers on the left, and then there's the guitarist and Tina Weymouth on the right. Tina Weymouth in a kind of extraordinary kind of parachute jumpsuit, and David Byrne in the middle. And throughout the entire thing, they're choreographed and they're in motion. In fact, any musician who's not playing a stationary instrument is in motion, and they're jumping up and down the entire time as she plays the bass guitar. It's fantastic. Every movement is choreographed. I think it's one of the thrilling bits of live performance I've ever seen. It's brilliant.
Do you think they're getting back together again because they're feeling that they ought to, because they're reaching an age where they ought to make up with each other? I think bands tend to go through this, don't you?
Well, whether they get back together or not, I don't know. But they've certainly he's certainly really regretful about the way he treated them, and it's quite big of him to come out and say that. I think.
Yeah.
I was quite admiring of that, and so you would like these people to say whatever it is they want to say to each other before any of them shuffles off their mortal coil.
This is it. Contrast that, of course, with the members of Pink Floyd, who seem to be doing anything but trying to make up with each other.
Fantastic, isn't it?
It's absolutely.
Oh my Lord!
I wonder if there's been
war between the Gilmore and I've never seen anything more vicious.
Never.
Remember when Polly Sampson said that thing about him being anti-Semitic and narcissistic and self-obsessed and all that, And Gilmore simply endorsed the tweet, didn't he? He said something, every word palpably true or something, he said.
Oh, my God.
I think that's all he said. And you think, that is the most damning thing. How long did he spend sitting there before he hit the button? I mean, that is just incredible, really. They loathe and detest each other on a scale unequaled by most groups, I think.
This is a junction in the Word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
As you'll know, if you're a Patreon supporter and you join us on Friday evenings for, the way that all the best people start the weekend, which is with the word quiz. As you'll know, we've switched the focus of this over the last few weeks, so it's no longer seeking to identify an act. You're now seeking to identify an album, preferably a well-known, a classic album. And so we've done this over the last few weeks. And the one we've done this week is, well, it actually has two titles, doesn't it, really? Because it's the title that it's known by, and then there's the actual title that it has, Mark. Isn't that right?
Absolutely right. In fact, not that many people know it as The Beatles, do they?
Well, it is The Beatles.
Which is an extraordinary thing in itself. The idea that after Sgt. Pepper they would have such a florid and complicated name as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and such an incredibly florid and complicated cover, than to go to a completely blank cover and a completely blank name. What an amazing art statement. Yeah, but we did the White Album. And I was just putting together some thoughts for the quiz questions. I just came across a couple of things that I didn't actually know. And one is the story of, well, I suppose the continuing story, indeed, of Bungalow Bill. You know the story of Bungalow Bill?
Go on.
Well, Bungalow Bill, when they were out there at Rishikesh, which is also interesting in that they wrote, I think, 19 of the 30 songs that finished up on the record out there. And I think also possibly wrote things like Not Guilty and Child of Nature, a.k.a. Jealous Guy and Junk and Sour Milk Sea and Mean Mr. Butler. I mean, it was an incredibly productive period. But anyway, out there was, among the group of people, was a PR woman who was the PR for the Maharishi, a woman called Nancy. And it's interesting, I think that the Maharishi would have had a PR in his first place. But anyway, she was then assigned to the Beatles, to look after the Beatles in case there was any kind of news problem with them being there that she would have to deal with. And her son was there, a guy called Richard A. Cook III, Americans. And while he was there, he went tiger hunting. and he from a treehouse, from a wooden platform. This isn't terribly challenging, I don't think, or not a lot of skill involved. He killed a tiger, and then came back to the camp with his mum, and told the Maharishi and John Lennon all about it. Went into this whole thing about how fantastic it was to kill this tiger. And his mum was immensely proud of him, saying what a wonderful thing he'd done. I know, can you imagine? It was just all this terrible pause.
I hate it when my kids do that.
I know.
Don't have killed the tiger.
Be supportive.
Oh, don't.
Whatever they've done, whatever they've done, you've got to be supportive. Yes, he killed the tiger. What a man, And anyway, so he tells the Maharishi then is very, very sceptical and says, "You've done this terrible thing. You have taken away a life, etc., etc." And he goes a bit quiet. Anyway, he's a bit remorseful. John Lennon says absolutely nothing, I think, at all. And then several weeks later, he's back in America, and his sister says, "Come and listen to this. Have you heard the new record by the Beatles? Come and listen to this song." And he plays him the song, and of course there's a line that goes, "He went out tiger hunting with his elephant and gun. In case of accidents, he always took his mum. He's the all-American, bullet-headed Saxon mother's son." Can you imagine what you'd feel like if you heard that and you knew that the song was about you. And this had the most powerful effect on the guy and completely changed his life. I'm sure John Lennon was really thrilled. At this point, he stopped hunting and he took up photography and he became a wildlife photographer. And he worked for 22 years for National Geographic, and winning awards and stuff like that, and giving lectures and taking photographs of wildlife. Isn't that interesting? Do you think? I was just trying to imagine what it'd be like to hear a song that was being played internationally and realise that it was about you.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? It's like, like William Zanzinger listening to, just hang on a second. That's pretty overt because that actually has his name in it, But anyway, so that was interesting.
So for the rest of his life, when he was in social occasions, when the conversation turned to the Beatles, he must have half wanted to tell people.
Yeah.
There was a song by the Beatles written about me. Did you know that?
Then simultaneously immensely consumed with embarrassment, especially as a wildlife photographer who was very evangelical about the preservation of wildlife and the celebration of these beautiful creatures, to think that he had a past that was so terrible that John Lennon wrote a song about him.
That's absolutely
that was really interesting. I didn't know that at all. I didn't know that. And the other thing I discovered, which I didn't know, which is only a small thing actually, is about Sexy Sadie, about the song Sexy Sadie, which of course is about the Maharishi. And in fact, it was originally called Maharishi, wasn't it? And George Harrison said, you can't have a song called Maharishi because it's obviously about him. You can't do that. And but anyway, John Lennon left early, after Ringo, but before the other two. Ostensibly, he says because he objected to the Maharishi's treatment of women, didn't he? Do you remember that he was being seedy and doing things attempting to do things that he thought were very, very substandard, And it's just interesting that story was actually put about by Magic Alex, their pal, their minder, who was classic case of, Magic Alex, an attention-seeking kind of narcissist who was always saying, I can do this, I can build you a studio, I can do whatever, getting all the attention and delivering nothing. But anyway, Magic Alex bowled in one night, apparently, and went on about how he thought the Maharishi was trying to cop off with some of the girls and things. And anyway, John Lennon wrote a song about it. And since then, the one thing, if you said to anybody, the Maharishi, and they go, well, of course, Maharishi, it's a bit of a fall from grace there. But I just discovered this thing which said that, that there is absolutely no evidence for this at all. He said McCartney and Harrison later discovered that the accusations to be untrue, and John Lennon's wife Cynthia, in the book she wrote, she reported there was not one shred of evidence or justification. I just thought that was really interesting. This is one of the first cases of cancelling, I think. Here's a guy whose career was completely cancelled by, which you cannot argue with. Everybody, the one thing everyone knows about the Maharishi was he was chasing after the girls,
Yeah.
And they're claiming that absolutely none of that happened. And John Lennon just took the story from Magic Alex and wrote a song about it.
It was just hearsay. That's extraordinary.
I thought it was interesting. Really interesting.
It's amazing how the Beatles just keep on, producing those stories. Well, it's like a few years ago. Neither you and I knew that Mr. Mustard was a real person.
That's right. I think we discovered that from a Mark Lewis
lecture, yeah, because Mark had found him.
Was a guy
he lives up there. Mr. Mustard lived not far from where I am now.
Yeah,
he's. I think it was a divorce or something.
Yeah. And
his wife, it was mental cruelty or whatever, because he was so mean. He got shaved in the dark, all that.
That's
right. He wouldn't spend any money at all. So I got my copy of the White Album in front of me, Mark. And my special number. Have you got your copy there?
Oh, I have. Hang on.
Oh, God. Oh, this is like Top Trumps. This is Top Trumps.
Oh, okay. Go on.
Okay, if mine's lower than yours, do I get to keep both of them?
I'm looking at mine now, and you have won. I've got to tell you, you've won by several 100,000.
Well, I don't know. Mine's 0389700.
I've beaten you.
What? I bought this the day it came out.
I've beaten you. I'm 0287531. So surely that's mine's. You bought that the day it came out. It was already in the 300,000.
Yeah. Definitely.
Wow! How amazing! Oh God! Well, I think I win.
Oh well,
astonishing.
I'm not giving you mine anyway.
No, but that's just a lot of fun just digging around about that record, Also the thing about the tensions when they made it, because suddenly Yoko Ono appears in the studio.
Yeah.
And so Paul McCartney goes, well, okay, fair enough, brings in his girlfriend Francie Schwartz. And she's there, sitting there, watching the record, And then Patty Harrison came in and Maureen Starkey came in. And it went from that kind of glorious thing the year before of everybody singing from the same hymn sheet to terrible, friction and tension, didn't it? And there's a lovely thing about the box of chocolate, Savoy truffle, about Clapton being obsessed. He's absolutely addicted to eating chocolates and ate a particular brand of chocolate, which contained the Savoy truffle. And was told by his dentist that he'd done such terrible damage that he couldn't eat chocolates anymore. So George Harrison wrote Savoy truffle as a kind of joke, really, to torture him, just to list names of chocolates that he liked from his favourite box of chocolates. I never knew that one.
No. Well, there you go. That's the White Album, which was the answer in our Friday night quiz. And if you're a Patreon supporter, we'd like to see you there in future. Please be with us.
The Word Podcast, 2 cocoa tins and a piece of string.
So I've been thinking about the question in the light of all these financial institutions buying up the catalogues of legendary performers.
Yeah.
We've all read about that stuff. And, all in the hope that they're really sound investments and that they will keep on, the money will keep on rolling in from them. And they probably will. But it made me think about a whole business about which musical acts go down in history and which ones, regardless of their merits, just don't. And so it intrigues me that if you look in the kind of jazz, crooning, swing era, Frank Sinatra is still massively revered. Bing Crosby, not.
No, not at all.
And Frank Sinatra would be the first one to say that he wasn't fit to lace Bing Crosby's shoes. You know what I mean? So much of what he got from Bing Crosby. And I'm just intrigued as to how that happened. And
isn't a lot of that, in the case of Sinatra, isn't a lot of that to do with the fact that it's the films? It's the films, the fashion. He's entrenched in so many different worlds. He's something much bigger than just a singer. Whereas Bing Crosby, although he did all those films, that's not how you remember it. People just think of him as a singer.
I suppose that people would say about Frank Sinatra, if you ask them to choose an adjective to describe Frank Sinatra, I'm guessing here now, they would say cool.
Yeah.
And cool is the adjective that everybody uses nowadays in every context, because it saves them having to be specific about whatever it is that they like.
Yeah.
They just say cool. And that
also reflects well on them for thinking them cool.
I suppose so. Whereas Bing Crosby, nobody ever accused of being cool, although he was.
Yeah.
And actually, side note, if you want to see the most extraordinarily accomplished thing you've ever seen on a cinema screen, go and watch High Society and go and watch the scene where Bing in his hotel room sings, is it called I Love You, Samantha? Mm. And as he's doing it, he brushes off his coat, he ties a bow tie properly as he's singing it, he fills his cigarette case.
Yeah.
He puts his cufflinks in. He does absolutely everything while singing "I Love You, Samantha." It's just, and it's one shot.
It's incredible. There's one shot where they record "Now You Has Jazz."
Yeah,
remember that?
Yeah.
Take some skins, jazz begins. Then you take a bass. Now we're getting someplace. Take a box on the rocks. That is all recorded completely live. So they're there in front of an audience. There are microphones hanging up above them, but the version that came out in the film, the version that came out on the record, is the version that they filmed. It's phenomenal. You can't believe it. If you listen to any of the Bing Crosby, Louis Armstrong duets, the level of accomplishment is just ridiculous. It is.
There's nobody who can do what they did. Anyway, there's Bing Crosby, kind of forgotten. And, if you go in the 1920s, I know I'm reading a couple of books about Bing Crosby recently, and the big star of jazz in the 1920s, the huge star, the man they called the king of jazz was Paul Whiteman. Completely forgotten. Probably largely because he was a white man. I mean, and at that stage, the stars of jazz were white. And then later on, this was all kind of reversed, and the stars of jazz were African-American, fair enough. But Paul Whiteman just got completely swept away in that change, And then you go further on, and you go the era of the crooners and the Emma middle of the road singers. And nobody talks about Andy Williams anymore, do they?
No.
Nobody talks about Perry Como. These people are absolutely huge.
You've got to have a story. If you look at the current hierarchy, is entirely manufactured by TV and by feature films. The kind of people they make documentaries about. And so they are Stones, the Beatles, Elton, Queen, Led Zeppelin, Dylan, aren't they? Nirvana, Nick Drake, Little Richard.
Tragedies.
Jerry Lee Lewis, tragedy. Johnny Cash, really good example. There's a
really good example.
Just the other night. And so, I'm not saying they're not fantastic. Of course they're fantastic, but it's easy to construct. So Elvis, although Elvis actually might be tripped up, his legacy soon by this Sofia Coppola movie that's about to come out. But anyway, those people all have stories. The people I think that are in danger of fizzling out actually in 10 or 20 years are people like Paul Simon, I think. Because there is no story about Paul Simon. You say Paul Simon, somebody, immediately you just think of your favourite Paul Simon song. Yeah. If you say Nirvana, if you say Nick Drake, people have another view of it. They see it as a movie to which that was the soundtrack, a slightly tragic movie. Johnny Cash, exactly. You say Johnny Cash, you don't think of his music, you think of Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison or whatever, or Johnny and June or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So I think the Eagles is another example. There's no great story. There is a good story about the Eagles. There's nothing classic. Joni Mitchell, no amazing story. I mean, if you get into it, it's extraordinary. But there's nothing really pronounced about her story that will make it that memorable. And there are certain groups that I feel now are slightly on the way out. The Doors is one.
Yeah,
I think the Kinks is another actually.
Yeah,
the Kinks I can feel are just drifting towards the horizon, and they're going to disappear from view in 5 or 10 years' time. I don't really know why. I mean, partly they don't exist, but there isn't any great story. They fell out. The two brothers fell out. They fell back together again, etc. So I think, a lot of it's to do with the fact that if it's a story, a sort of cinematic story, that will help immortalize you. And the other thing, I suppose, is that people are going to drop off this perch because their evangelists, their supporters, are just going to themselves disappear. I don't know anybody. When we were at Smash Hits and stuff, there was a guy there called Fred Dell. Do you remember the wonderful Fred? Yeah. Fred, who was considerably older than us, and Fred was I think a member of, wasn't he, the Frank Sinatra fan club?
Yep.
And Fred would go on about acts from the 1950s and acts from pre-1950s with an amazing enthusiasm, and there are no equivalents of people like Fred left doing that anymore. So it's interesting. But you're absolutely right. The ones who get remembered aren't necessarily the ones of enormous worth.
Is anybody playing a Buddy Holly record tonight?
No.
Or an Everly Brothers record?
Buddy Holly completely fading away.
And these are great artists.
Yeah, and they've been some musicals in his case, and
but it's also what happens in the kind of radio and the media background, in that they're constantly redefining what is an acceptable oldie. So an oldie used to mean a record from the 1950s, and then it was a record from the 1960s. Well, currently it's a record from the 1990s is an oldie. Yeah. And anything older, anything from the 70s sounds quaint to anybody listening to kind of magic radio or whatever. Let alone anything from the 50s.
Yeah.
And, so this stuff just drops out of contention. And it's interesting that the kind of the jukebox musicals, which have been so successful in the West End and on Broadway and all over the world, I'm sure, in the last 20 years or whatever, must be a conscious effort on the part of copyright holders to just try and get people interested in them again. So Jersey Boys, which has been running for ages in the West End, I think probably still is, that's the attempt to keep the four seasons on the planet, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's called Jersey Boys. It's not called the Four Seasons. And Ain't Too Proud, which opened in the West End recently, is an attempt to do the same thing with the Temptations.
Yeah.
You know, and I grew up with the Temptations and the Four Tops and Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, and you thought that music would never go away. Well, it kind of has done, I think.
It has.
Tragically, you know.
No, but it's the ones that tick everyone. Bob Marley's a really good example, I think. Bob Marley, tragically young when he died. Yeah. But also, you look at the ingredients in that story, where he came from, his parents, the young mother and the white father, you know, the early days forming the group and rehearsing in the graveyard. The politics, the religion, Rastafari, being at the airport when Haile Selassie arrived in Jamaica, you know, the assassination attempt. It just being the first, you know, the first third world superstar, as it were.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
every single element of that is fantastic, and also producing an incredible collection of really good songs that work on the radio. That's another thing. If they don't work on the radio, you know.
I was really interviewing with David Furnish recently, who is kind of Elton John's de facto manager, and he was talking about the the Rocket Man and all this stuff.
Yeah,
and what they've found scored most highly with young people around Elton John was the story about being gay and the stories of his addictions. It wasn't about his music at all.
Oh, really?
It was the drama of his life. And so when you make a film about him in the 21st century, that's the stuff you put to the fore.
Yeah.
The kind of the tragedy. This is my truth.
That's so true.
All those things that are kind of social media, you know, tropes. You know, that's what you put at the fore. And that's what you have to do with all these people to keep them in the forefront of public attention. You have to just you don't have to so much have to reinvent the music. You have to reinvent the personality.
Yeah.
You know, with a different edge that just appeals to however the world is that you're launching it.
But that's so true, because people who couldn't sing you a single Elton John song, you know, I've talked about people in their 20s and 30s, they will nearly always tell you, Elton John, isn't that the guy who once rang up his manager from a hotel room and said, it's too windy outside, I don't like the weather. Can you do something about it? You know what I mean? It's tantrums and tiaras, isn't it? It's the tennis match that everyone remembers. But that's really interesting.
Yeah. So here's my prediction. You know, I think you need a really good story to build a legend on, and that's why I predict, sad but true, that Dave Clark 5 will be completely forgotten, but Badfinger will live on.
Yes.
Because somebody will make a film about Badfinger.
Yeah.
Because it's such a sad story that they're bound to. And you've got a sad story and fantastic music. And I think that was what made what brought Nick Drake back. It's not just the quality of the music, it's the sadness. It's the attachment of sadness, you know. He didn't get his shot. You know what I mean?
And when you listen to Nick Drake's music, you immerse yourself in that notion, don't you? That's what you tend to think about Nick Drake and Nick Drake's life, actually. Yeah. And how that colours the way the music sounds. Yeah. So yes.
Talking Nick Drake, we're returning to live events, aren't we, Mark? What's the date? Can't remember.
25th of Jan, is it? 25th of Jan. 25th of September we're talking about. 25th of September, quite soon.
That's Mark Ellis, my agent, 25th of Jan. What is it, 25th of September?
Yeah.
And we've got a new home, which is 21 Soho, which is very, very close, just walking distance from Tottenham Road Tube Station. And we're starting on that date. And we've got Richard Morton Jack talking about his book about Nick Drake, and also Kathy Unsworth talking about everything concerned with goth.
The world of goth.
With the world of goth. So,
Goths, goth mothers and goth fathers, which is really interesting, isn't it? All the authors and all the characters from cultural history that she feels are kind of honorary goths. It's really good. She's terrific. They're both very, very entertaining talkers.
So come and join us. Details below.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
It's a birthday podcast special slot, and the birthday guest is Geltex. Very nice to see you, Geltex. A great long-time supporter of the pod.
And he doesn't look a day older, does he?
Doesn't look a day older, that's right. Do you have a question you wanted to put to the panel?
I was listening to one of your podcasts a few weeks ago, and I remembered there was a legendary album that a review popped up in Sounds by the heavy metal correspondent. Was it Malcolm Dome, or was he?
Oh, I remember Malcolm. Yeah, he was on Kerrang!
And it was the album that we all wanted because he raved about it so much, yet no one had. It was Live at Budokan by the Michael Schenker Group.
Did you eventually get it?
No, I've never had it. I moved over to synth pop and indie music the year later, so the window passed. So I'm just wondering, was there an album when you were growing up that you really that you and all your friends wanted and you never could get?
Oh, right. Well, I can remember there were some that were considered to be very, very cool that Ron was talking about. My hard to get hold of was Tim Buckley's Goodbye and Hello, The Madcap Laughs by Syd Barrett, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. I remember that was a big thing. And John Phillips' solo album. The record I always wanted was The Great White Wonder, which was the bootleg, the Bob Dylan bootleg, which everybody, went on about. It was incredibly hard to get hold of. And I didn't hear it till years later. Don't know. Dave, have you got any?
I mean, at the time, people couldn't afford any records. You used to go and visit people who had records that you didn't have because you had no hope of getting them. I would advance the theory, possibly a bold one, that all records recorded at the Budokan aren't very good. They all sounded really exotic and really exciting. Generally, because you couldn't get them. Because usually they were Japanese imports, yes? Particularly in the 70s and 80s. And the Japanese imports were usually very lavishly packaged and very beautiful vinyl. And
80 gram.
Well, it probably was. It
says the connoisseur.
It was probably ounces.
Chin.
It was ounces in those days, Yeah. But I think I've got Weather Report in Tokyo at the Budokan, and I've got Cheap Trick at the Budokan.
Oh, that's good.
And there's something about the Budokan that sort of it was never quite. You never quite got the hysteria that you ought to have, really.
Was that to do with the nationality of the audience, though, who are quite restrained?
I tell you, it's particularly interesting at the beginning. Santana's Lotus, three records there. Stop me if I'm boring you. Recorded at the Budokan. Do you know what the opening track is? Go on. It's A Minute's Silence, which the audience rigorously observe.
Oh my goodness!
It starts with silence, and then they slowly
try that at Donington.
Try that at Donington, mate. That's what I'm going to say. So did you ever get that record in the end?
No, I never got it. But years later, about 6 years ago, we actually went to Tokyo on holiday.
All right.
And we had a guide, and we were standing on the Imperial Palace, looking out over the ancient Tokyo skyline, ignoring the modern stuff. And our guide pointed out that we see that building there. That's the Budokan.
There you go.
And that's as close I ever got.
Well, you know what the Budokan was mainly used for? Wrestling.
Was it?
Yes,
Okay.
that was its primary use. It was sumo wrestling, in use every night, apart from on Saturday evenings with Miles Davis and Cheap Trick. Block and Santana or something like that. Then it was back to the grip and grin, on the following.
Isn't that an indication as to why it might not be sonically ideal for a purpose-built venues are slightly different from places that are normally wrestling.
I have to tell you, I've only been to Japan once, and it's it's nearly 40 years ago now. And on the flight to Japan, which went to Tokyo, which went via Anchorage, Alaska, because it went round that way in those days. Do you know, we shared our flight with a bunch of returning sumo wrestlers who'd just come back from doing an event in Paris. Now,
how many seats do they have to have?
There you go. There you go. If you're going to be in a queue in the galley or for the gents, the last thing you want in the world is a bunch of
sumo wrestlers stuck in there. Trying to get out.
Unbelievable amounts of space.
Oh, no.
We were on the metro and waiting for the train. The train arrived, the doors opened, and this sumo wrestler came out, filling the doorway.
This is it. They do. They have a special soup, don't they, to make them really fat. And then they have huge, great lunches. Then they sleep for 2 hours in order that they shouldn't lose any of that weight.
Okay.
It's the opposite of what everybody
God, what's in the soup? How fascinating.
There's a special soup. I remember seeing a film about this, absolutely. Yeah.
Lard soup.
For the benefit of this conversation, I'm an expert on sumo wrestlers. So, yes. It obviously wasn't to be if you weren't to get that record, no. But it's better in your imagination than it would be on your shelves. That's my
I believe so. Yeah,
comfort prediction. But happy birthday as of last week. I'm sorry we were a bit late catching up with you, and thank you for your support.
No, that's fine. Great lost album.
Oh right, go on.
This is "Married Alive" by the Mood Elevator.
Oh, right.
You've probably heard of Brendan Benson.
Oh, yes, I have. Go on.
In Jack White. Jack White's friend. He was in the Raconteurs. Well, his backing band were called the Well-Fed Boys, but the other guitarist, Chris Plum's a really good vocalist, and so this is the album that Brendan Benson's band recorded, but instead of Brendan on vocals, it's Chris Plum. Right. It's really, really good. I think it's better than any Brendan Benson album, to be honest with you.
What's it called again? One more time?
Married Alive.
That's a great title.
Yeah.
Married Alive.
It's an album with an arc. Relationship goes to pot, and then his ex gets married, and his reaction at the wedding and stuff. Really good album.
All right, well, consider it plugged. Thank you very much for that.
We'll plug it.
You're listening to The Word Podcast, where the time is whenever you want it to be.
And now we welcome another of our valued Patreon supporters to celebrate on the occasion of his birthday, or pretty near his birthday, Avi Chowdhury. Avi, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, David.
It's very nice to see you. And happy birthday.
When was the birthday?
The birthday was actually in February.
God, it's taken a long time to organise this.
You shy devil.
but my birthday present, or one of my birthday presents, was a dose of COVID. So,
no,
dear,
that knocked me out of doing.
Not since February, I hope.
Not since February, no.
Poor old you.
So, what's the log that you've got to throw on the fire on this occasion, or question, or whatever, assertion, whatever you want to do?
It's an unusual topic, but one that's been kind of playing on my mind recently. Bill Wyman.
Oh, right.
I haven't thought about Bill Wyman for many years because, why would you?
Yeah.
But he's come up a couple of times recently. First of all, in the Brian Jones documentary.
Oh, yes,
Isn't
of course.
he fantastic in that?
Brilliant, but weirdly filmed on an iPhone.
Absolutely.
Yes, very, very badly filmed. But he's
but not badly filmed at all. Nick Broomfield, I spoke to Nick Broomfield about doing this because they weren't going to shoot. Because Nick Broomfield's plan was, when he was making that film, he said, you don't want to get all these old legends on camera because they look so terrible. He said, people are so distracted by what they look like. You're not listening to a word they're saying. So the idea was they'd be out of shot. They just disembodied voices. But he got Bill Wyman, and Bill Wyman was on such form. He thought, we've got to start filming this. And then he had a film crew, and they started dicking around doing what film crews usually do. So, not enough light in here. Can we move the sofa over there? Can we move the house a few feet to the left? All that stuff. And Nick Bradfield said, no, don't bother. Just pulled out his mobile phone, held it up to him for about half an hour, and he's absolutely fantastic.
He was fantastic.
He was so insightful, wasn't he?
Oh, God. And he talked about, he said, just listen to this little tiny bit here, and you could hear the bit that Brian's playing. The little bits of guitar embroidery, which I thought was really, and he was so uncynical and generous as well.
I know, and it sort of got me to thinking, because one of my birthday presents was a book about Charlie Watts called Charlie's Good Tonight. And obviously Bill Wyman features in that. And it just got me to thinking about what a weird and incongruous figure he is, because he was born in 1936, so he's actually closer in age to Elvis than Mick or Keith. So that was one thing. He's in that sort of elite group of rock stars who did national service.
Absolutely. There's not many of them.
Yeah.
And he changed his name from Bill Perks to Bill Wyman after a mate of his in the army, which seems a very thing to do.
I always thought it was a cowboy. Okay, well, you're probably right.
Well, I mean, but this is Wikipedia. So.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So all that was very odd, and I recall seeing a documentary that they released at the time of the special edition of Exile on Main Street, and they were all talking about Nellcôte and tales of rock and roll excess. And in the middle of all that, Bill Wyman popped up, complaining about the fact that you couldn't get Birds Custard in the south of France. And I just, this guy is just, he doesn't fit in at all. And yet he's the one person to complain, to claim on record, je suis un rockstar.
Je suis not. But didn't he get the job effectively because he had a van? Or I'm not being unfair.
No, he didn't have a van. Ian Stewart had a van. No, but Bill, he had a bass amp. I think he had a bass amp. Something like that.
Yeah. So they liked his equipment.
Yes.
So to speak.
I always think that Bill Wyman is not so much a member of the Rolling Stones, but a witness to the Rolling Stones. He was he was under deep cover, he was a sleeper in the Rolling Stones.
Well, he's a great archivist, isn't he?
He was.
Yeah.
Well, he famously wrote down the name of every woman he slept with in the 1960s and 70s.
Well, didn't Mick ring him up at one point and keep asking him questions about what he was doing on certain days and all that? And he sort of said, look, are you by any chance writing a memoir? And you've forgotten because I'm not giving you all this information. Didn't that happen?
It didn't. It's true.
Yeah,
it's true.
Because he'd written it all down.
Mick's memoirs never happened, has it?
Mick gave the money back.
He had to, yes.
Now that's pretty unique.
Yeah, I didn't know.
So first, he got a lot of money. He started doing it, and then he thought, "No, I don't feel like this." So he gave the money back. And again, I give Mick Jagger points for doing that. Of course, the other thing I have to throw in on the subject, Bill Wyman, because it's still my favorite story. And he told me this a few years ago about when he tried to leave the Rolling Stones. He said, next tour, you've thought it out too long. I've got a restaurant to run. I've got all this stuff to do. Count me out. 2 years later, they rang him up and said, right, we're starting to rehearse in next week in Canada, or whatever. He says, no, I told you to count me out. We thought you were joking.
So he couldn't believe it. What? Who would leave the Rolling Stones? Well, I am.
It's just, I think it's a wonderful story.
Birds Custard.
It's a wonderful story because it indicates if you're a member of the Rolling Stones, there's no HR department you can hand in your notice to. It doesn't. No, seriously, it's not like anything else, is it? You're in it for life unless something really odd happens, And he said, he gave an interview the other week where he said, I've not regretted it at all. You see, and they've had 25 years without him, haven't they? The current guy has been playing bass in the Rolling Stones longer than Bill Wyman.
Absolutely.
It's just absolutely extraordinary. But
I like that idea that if it was an age-style relationship, you then have to have kind of periodical kind of reviews of how it's going. You know, performance reviews.
You've got to say,
it's going for you. Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? We don't see you in the band.
I see myself running a restaurant in Kings Road.
That's right, yeah. Being very happy, actually.
Well, anyway.
But there were a series of programs on the BBC called My Life as a Rolling Stone.
Oh, yeah.
And there was one about Charlie Watts, one about Mick,
There wasn't one about Bill, was there?
No.
Well, he left by the time.
There was about Ronnie Wood.
Was one about Ronnie? Well, he is a Rolling Stone.
Well, you see, that was the film they made when they were effectively a four-piece.
Yeah.
And so they couldn't revisit it really with Bill. And of course, to me, there'll only ever be one Rolling Stones, which is the kind of original five-piece. Cool. Everything else, except no imitations. But anyway, well, it's always good to catch up and to talk about these important issues.
Important things. Bill Wyman, that's lovely. I've thought about him for ages.
I hope he appreciates it. I'm sure he listens.
I'm sure he does. Sure. I'm sure he does.
He'd be mortified to hear that thing about what Nick Broomfield thought people looked like when they were over a certain age on film. But anyway.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.